Senator McKenzie.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, today, along with Senator Smith, we are moving this bill to step in where the Albanese Labor government and particularly the Minister for Transport, Catherine King, have failed. When I was chosen to take on this portfolio as Shadow Minister, I determined that if the government was not going to do their job, the opposition will make sure that we step up and do the right thing by everyday Australians. Airlines around the world are on notice. Consumers are absolutely fed up with higher airfares, coupled with declining service standards and increasing interruptions. The ACCC's latest airline report showed service reliability remains below long-term industry averages, as flight cancellations and delays remain higher than they should be. Nearly 30% of flights were either cancelled or delayed across the January holiday period, showing there has been no improvement in the on-time performance over the past 12 months. And that's according to data released by the Bureau of Infrastructure and Transport Research Economics. And despite the Prime Minister's claim that Australia has the most competitive airline market in the world, bar none, a claim contradicted by his own ministers and government's Green Paper, Australia has stumbled into a situation where the domestic aviation market is dominated by two airlines. More than 93% of the domestic market is owned or managed by Qantas and Virgin. When this is coupled with dominance of these two airlines' international code-share arrangements and frequent flyer programs, the picture becomes very clear that there is an imbalance in consumer choice. The Airline Passenger Protection Pay-on-Delay Bill seeks to ensure that consumer choice, convenience and reliability is being prioritised over big business. This issue transcends mere inconvenience. It is a matter of fairness, transparency and respect for Australian consumers. The global airline industry has witnessed significant changes over the past decade, with jurisdictions around the world bolstering consumer protections to ensure that passengers are treated fairly. For instance, in the EU, the UK and Canada, common rules of compensation and assistance to passengers in the event of denied boarding, flight cancellations or long delays have been established. This comprehensive framework sets a benchmark, ensuring that passengers are not left stranded or out of pocket due to disruptions within the control of airlines. In contrast, Australia's approach to consumer protections in the airline industry, while robust in theory, have often fallen short in practice. The Airline Customer Advocate's annual report highlights a trend of increasing complaints, with issues ranging from flight cancellations and delays to mishandled baggage and disputes over refunds. This trend underscores a growing disconnect between consumer expectations and the services delivered by our airlines. And a case in point is the recent actions by the self-styled national carrier Qantas. Once a symbol of reliability and national pride, Qantas has been at the centre of escalating consumer complaints. Issues have ranged from significant delays, inexplicable cancellations, allegations of misleading consumers about their rights to refunds or compensation, and I could go on. Indeed, it took the intervention of this Senate through the cost of living inquiry last year to shame the former Qantas CEO, Alan Joyce, into honouring or refunding nearly $500 million in flight credits beyond December 2023. And I thank Senators Dean Smith, Matt Canavan and Jane Hume for their work to ensure that former Qantas CEO Alan Joyce fronted that inquiry. Unfortunately, Labor and the Greens and Senator Pocock have continued to block any further scrutiny of Mr Joyce by voting down any attempt for this Senate to force him to account for his time as leader of the nation's largest carrier and the part that he played in the flight credit debacle, the serious allegations around ghost flights raised by the ACCC and his involvement in the illegal sacking of thousands of baggage handlers. These issues, coupled with the increasing number of unexplainable cancelled flights, severe delays and frequent situation where you'd fly to one destination and your bags would fly to somewhere else, has led to the general public to coin the term that you've been joiced. In a landmark move underscoring the gravity of these issues, the ACCC launched legal proceedings against Qantas. This lawsuit centred on allegations of misleading conduct regarding consumer rights to refunds for cancelled or significantly altered flights, marks a pivotal moment in our pursuit of stronger consumer protections. The ACCC's actions send a clear message. No entity, irrespective of its heritage or position or its mates in position of power, stands above the law. The challenges faced by consumers extend beyond Qantas, reflecting a broader systemic issue within the aviation industry, and these challenges highlight the need for a comprehensive review and overhaul of consumer protections in the airline sector. Australian consumers deserve a clear, enforceable rights that ensure fairness and transparency. Drawing lessons from jurisdictions with robust consumer protection frameworks, it's clear that Australia must evolve its approach. And this evolution involves not only adopting best practices from around the world, but also innovating to address unique challenges faced by Australian consumers. Our vast geography and reliance on air travel for domestic connectivity amplify the impact of airline service disruptions, making strong consumer protections not just beneficial but essential, and I'm sure you'll hear many contributions as we debate this bill that go to that fact. Ensuring fairness and equity in transport is of paramount importance to every individual who relies on air travel, an issue that resonates deeply with our values as the National Party. And as champions of the regions, we understand better than anyone the lifeline that airline travel represents for connecting our communities, supporting our local economies and bridging the distance that separates us from our cities, our families and our business interests, and indeed to health and education services, as is often the case. It is with this understanding and commitment to serving the people of regional Australia that we recognise the urgent need for enhanced consumer protections in the aviation sector. The Harris Review's recommendations for reforming the Sydney Airport Demand Management Act also play a crucial role in our vision for a more reliable and efficient aviation industry. The review's recommendations focus on introducing more dynamic and responsive management practices that can adapt to evolving operational realities whilst minimising environmental and community impacts. By embracing these recommendations, we can unlock Sydney Airport's potential to deliver more reliable services and thereby reducing the frequency of disruptions that so deeply affects passengers, not just into Sydney Airport. This approach not only benefits consumers but also enhances the operational efficiency of airlines and the broader economy. Addressing the operational constraints at Sydney Airport, can I just ask, Chair, that that's just a bit too loud for my hearing. Thank you. This approach not only benefits consumers but also enhances the operational efficiency of airlines and the broader economy. Addressing the operational constraints at Sydney Airport presents a golden opportunity to enhance efficiency and reduce passenger disruptions. Unfortunately, after months of sitting on her hands, the Transport Minister has finally announced the government's response to that review in February. And the response can only be described as underwhelming, but it is so almost emblematic of this particular minister's work in this space. Only minor tweaks have been made to a system that needs wholesale reform. The Coalition will continue to advocate for greater transparency in slot allocations and for ways to increase competition to ensure that consumers are not the ones being penalised for an airport that has been constrained by government intervention and legislation. In government, we introduced a grocery code of conduct, and we are always on the side of Australian consumers, and this bill allows us to once again demonstrate that there is one political movement within the Senate that is absolutely going to stand up for Australian consumers against big corporations, and that is the Liberal and the National Party. This bill requires the Transport Minister to introduce an airline code of conduct and a series of obligations to protect passengers that find themselves at the mercy of airlines during significant disruptions. The code would be a significant series of reforms enhancing consumer protections. It is clear and necessary. The time for action is now. We must work together, government, industry and consumers, to improve standards and safeguards. Every single person in Australia has a story of missing significant family events, business meetings or indeed health services as a result of the aviation sector's failure. Within 12 months of the commencement of this Act, the Transport Minister must make rules prescribing carriers' obligations in relation to flights to and from Australia and within Australia, including connecting flights. This includes an airline code of conduct to provide greater protections for passengers of all carriers, regardless of the type of service. And the purpose of the Aviation Industry Code of Conduct is to ensure the fair and proper treatment of passengers and that passengers reach their intended destination as booked. And we remember when Qantas was trying to argue that flights weren't from a specific place to a specific destination at a particular time. That's what Australian consumers thought they were buying when they purchased a ticket, but not if you were buying it from Alan Joyce's Qantas. This bill would actually deal with that issue. It would also supplement the Australian consumer laws and extend those protections to all carriers operating to and within Australia. The Code must also make provision for the recourse or intervention available to passengers in the event of improper conduct by carriers, and would strengthen the role of the airline consumer advocate and the ACCC in dealing with complaints. The Code requirements for a consistent definition of a ticket of carriage to apply to all tickets of carriage issued by carriers, including the minimum rights which passengers and third parties are guaranteed when they purchase a ticket of carriage from a carrier. The Minister would also be required to address the most significant issues that affect passengers, including delays, cancellations, denial of boarding, lost or damaged baggage and seating allocations of minors. Drawing inspiration from other jurisdictions that have already enhanced their consumer protections, the bill would require the implementation of a minimum standard of treatment framework for passengers affected by cancellations, significant disruptions or denial of boarding, both domestic and international. The bill requires the Minister to specify the standard of treatment in the event of a range of scenarios within the carrier's control, but also addresses situations where there are safety issues, mechanical failure, natural disaster or security events. And this ensures that passengers and airlines have clear obligations in place when unforeseen events occur. These obligations would also ensure clearer communication of entitlement, travel options in event of a disruption and any recourse available against a carrier. Airlines should be required to clearly inform passengers of their entitlements in cases of delays, cancellations and other service disruptions. And this includes straightforward information of entitlements to refunds, compensation and accommodation. Shouldn't have to email senators in this chamber to actually get action from airlines, which is what actually occurred following the aviation inquiry last year. Australian consumers being so frustrated with the aviation industry's pushback on getting simple refunds meant they had to go through their local MP, and that is absolutely untenable and what this bill seeks to address. Clear information, clear recourse and an understanding when consumers purchase their ticket, what are their rights. We should look at the legal case between Qantas and the ACCC as a warning and ensure that carriers cannot weasel their way out of obligations and that our consumer laws are actually designed to protect. The obligations would also address an issue that affects many passengers travelling with children by ensuring that children under the age of 14 are seated in close proximity to a parent, guardian, tutor at no additional cost. This provides peace of mind for parents and guardians that they will not be separated from their children by computers randomly assigning them seats far away from their children in what is often crowded seating next to strangers. The Minister has failed on multiple accounts and has been this chamber and the opposition that has had to drag her kicking and screaming to address the obvious failures within our aviation sector. The ACCC cancellation and delays reporting has been reinstated thanks to the work of the opposition. In the evidence to the aviation inquiry last year, it was clear Qantas and Virgin operate under consumer protections when they're flying internationally. Why shouldn't their customers here onshore, here in Australia, be protected by a similar framework? If the Minister's not going to step up and do the job, we're very happy to do it for her. and we're looking forward to hopefully sending this to an inquiry for further expansion of the issues.
Senator Sheldon.
Good, thank you, Deputy President. I rise to speak on the Airline Passenger Protection Pay on Delay Bill 2024. Now, I want to start by making clear that the Albanese government is very supportive of ensuring businesses are accountable to their workers and their customers. Now, it won't come as a surprise to anyone that I personally am very supportive of that principle, especially when it comes to Qantas. Now, what I find astonishing is that Senator McKenzie is now claiming to be worried about the way Qantas behaves, because what we've never heard a peep out of Senator McKenzie and her colleagues and the Liberals and Nationals in the 9 years when they were in government, because all the times and the ways that Qantas ripped off their customers, all their staff during those 9 years, there was no interest from those opposite. In fact, they only did not take any action against Qantas. They had to go one step further, because at the same time Qantas was illegally sacking 1,700 people, it wasn't enough for the Liberals and Nationals to stand by and do nothing about it, but those opposite had to take the extra step of giving Qantas a $2 billion no-strings-attached handout. And we've seen how much the taxpayer money, so generously doled out by Senator McKenzie and her colleagues, has ended up in the pockets of Alan Joyce and his sycophants. Now, it would be funny, wouldn't it? Except for the fact that the very behaviour this bill was complaining about was being financially rewarded by the very authors of this bill. Now, of course, those opposite haven't turned over a new page at all. It was only last year we saw their true colours come through. At the hearing on closing the loopholes bill on the 10th of November, Senator McKenzie said, and I quote, "I find it offensive that you made an assertion that I support the Qantas Group underpaying wages. I am not on a unity ticket with Qantas and Alan Joyce when it comes to ripping off Qantas workers through labour hire. And do I ask you to withdraw that because I never have and never will?" Now, there you have it. She never has and never will support Qantas ripping off workers through labour hire. Fortunately, you don't have to take my word or her word for it, because just a few weeks later we had a vote on legislation to close the Qantas labour hire loophole, and what did Senator McKenzie and her colleagues do in the Liberals and Nationals? How did they vote? Well, they came into this chamber one by one and voted against that legislation. They swore their fealty to Alan Joyce and Qantas and their labour hire loophole. Now, it's a matter of public record for all eternity. Now, talk is cheap. Action is what really matters. And by voting against the legislation, you've proven that you have no interest in fixing the aviation industry. Now, let's take the case of the 1,700 Qantas workers illegally sacked in 2021. Just this week, 1,700 people and the Transport Workers Union have taken court action to determine compensation. Now, this government intervened in the case on behalf of those workers. What did the previous government do? Well, Minister McCormack said illegally sacking 1,700 people was, and I quote, "in the best interests of the company going forward." Christian Porter said illegally sacking 1,700 people was, and I quote, "a good model." Senator Cash said of illegally sacking 1,700 people, and I quote, "Qantas are entitled to make those decisions." That's the record of those opposite on Qantas. Now, I want to go to the evidence provided by the Bilateral Air Services Committee in September. I was on that committee, and so was the late Senator Linda White. And between us, we both have a bit of experience in taking on airline bosses. Now, through that inquiry, we heard from Damien Pollard. Mr Pollard was one of the 1,700 illegally sacked Qantas workers who were abandoned and left for dead by those opposite. Now, here's what Mr Pollard told the inquiry about the level of support he received from those opposite in his struggle against Qantas management, and I quote, "Mr Morrison refused to meet us, and I can remember that quite clearly. it's very hard to explain that we actually felt abandoned by the government of the time because nobody would meet with us except for the Labor opposition. The Morrison government offered no support, and they continue to praise Qantas and say that it was a decision for Qantas. Now, the feeling of abandonment, he said, was quite striking. I can remember many times various politicians and Prime Ministers saying, "We will govern for everybody," and we just felt that nobody wanted to tackle Qantas. He went on to say, "We were left to sink or swim until the Labor opposition came in, as well as the TWU, and started supporting us." Now, Mr Pollard went on to say, "Scott Morrison, as I said before, refused to meet with us. Michael McCormick did meet with us once. He said he could look for some support services hotlines for us." I also remember quite clearly that he told me that the best thing that ever happened to him was being retrenched in his early 40s. I thought at the time, it may be working for you, but it's not working for a lot of my colleagues, and I thought it was rather a strange comment. He went on to say, "It seems quite strange to say that gentlemen who met with that day seem more interested in telling his own story than listening to our story." That was a common consensus amongst the other delegates who attended the meeting that day. So that is the experience of Qantas workers desperately trying to get support from those opposite in their fight against Alan Joyce and Qantas. And in that context, and I look at this bill before the Senate today, at every previous opportunity when those opposite have had an opportunity to rein in Qantas, they instead have egged their behaviour on. When given the opportunity to save Ansett and Virgin from bankruptcy, those opposite let it collapse, while being more than happy to pump $2 billion into Qantas. Now, when this government intervened in the High Court to support the 1,700 illegally sacked Qantas workers, those opposite opposed it. When we closed the Qantas Labor loophole, those opposite sat on their hands and opposed it. It's clear that this bill is nothing more than a political stunt. In 9 years, those opposite have had no plan for the aviation industry, no reforms to make the industry fairer for the travelling public or the people who work in the industry. Now, together with Senator Sterle, I led an inquiry into the future of the aviation sector throughout 2021 and finishing shortly before the 2022 election. That inquiry looked extensively at the workforce challenges facing the industry, including the long-term impact of Qantas's aggressive outsourcing and labour hire strategy. The two coalition senators on that committee said in their dissenting report that looking at those workforce issues was a waste of time and a failure to properly examine genuine aviation issues.
Senator Sheldon. Senator McKenzie.
Point of order on relevancy.
It's relevant.
Chair.
It's relevant.
Hasn't mentioned consumer.
No, it is relevant. Senator Sheldon.
Now, as I said, that inquiry looked extensively at the workforce challenges facing the industry, including the long-term impact of Qantas's aggressive outsourcing and labour hire strategy. The two coalition senators on that committee said in their dissenting report that looking at those workforce issues was a waste of time and a failure to properly examine genuine aviation issues. But what did we see once aviation ramped up after lockdowns ended? We saw severe staffing issues that created chaos at our airports and led to Alan Joyce shifting blame onto passengers for not being match fit. It goes to show that those opposite have no idea about or interest in the broad range of challenges within the aviation industry. We've inherited a real mess in aviation, where the policy for the last decade seemed to be just about to leave everything up to the airlines and airports to self-regulate. Now, even in the rare cases where those opposites seemed to recognise there was an issue, as in the case of slots at Sydney Airport, which was commissioned by the Harris Review, they never bothered to act on the recommendations. The report was left to gather dust. And then last year, you won't believe it, Senator McKenzie recommended to her inquiry that the government should, and I quote, urgently respond to that report. They didn't respond to it when they were in government, but now they're out there saying we should respond to it urgently. You just can't take them seriously. There is no serious solutions being offered for the aviation sector by those opposite. They're just lame attempts to get a headline or to preempt what the government is already considering and trying to get ahead of. It's not a serious approach for them. In contrast, we are looking at the sector holistically through the aviation white paper, which will be released in the coming months. That will include looking at the issue of consumer rights that this bill purports to deal with. As the Minister said in a press conference on the release of the Green Paper late last year, and I quote, "We are seeking to deliver a more competitive aviation sector. It covers issues in relation to complaint handling processes, particularly when it comes to canvassing whether we do need a consumer bill or rights when it comes to aviation." And she has also previously said, and I quote, "We are considering whether options pursued in other jurisdictions, such as consumer rights charter or stronger ombudsman model, would deliver benefits for Australian aviation sector." Now, these are part of a string of critically important aviation responses that goes to the whole series of matters, including the Harris Review. Again, their comments were made more than 6 months ago, long before this latest thought bubble from the opposition. It could be any clearer than looking at this issue. When the Minister refers to other jurisdictions, I note there have been long-standing policy in places in a number of countries. While the previous government did nothing on this over 9 years, the EU has a scheme where passengers can get up to €600 if their flight is delayed by over 3 hours, and there are similar schemes in the UK and Canada. But it needs to be considered in the context of the broad range of reforms needed to begin fixing the industry. Each piece relates and impacts on the next piece. Pretty logical. But why would we have logic when we want to deal with the aviation industry when there's a chance just to get a headline rather than an outcome? Now, the Transport Workers Union has proposed also a Safe and Secure Skies Commission. I think an admirable suggestion. That would be an independent body empowered to keep skilled workers in jobs and lift standards by holding airports and airlines to account for safety and fairness. These are proposals the White Paper should be exploring because the industry needs genuine reform after a decade of malaise and inaction by those opposite. There's a real opportunity to get this right. There's a real opportunity for proper debate. There's actually an opportunity for proper consideration. A multi-billion-dollar industry that is critical to the arteries of this economy, critical to the social fabric of this country, and critical as a fundamental strategic economic approach to how we run our economy. It requires a sophisticated approach, not because I'm opposed to any suggestions, but because this is a stunt of a suggestion taken without consideration with all the other impacts of policy that's needed in this area. A white paper going to the strategies, the implementation, the impacts of all those reports for 9 years they've sat on needs to be properly considered, properly weighed up in the interest of all the travelling public and the Australian economy, because the aviation industry deserves something better than a political stunt by those opposite.
Senator Smith. Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. In the brief time that's available to me, I want to canvass a number of issues. But before I do that, let me just reflect on the contribution that Senator Sheldon has made, and I note that he's the only government senator speaking on this bill this morning, which I think is a powerful demonstration of the government's commitment to aviation consumer issues. Let me just make these quick points. When Senator Sheldon says the government has a holistic approach to aviation issues in this country, people should hear in that word holistic delay, procrastination. When Senator Sheldon talks about the government and the Minister for Transport considering the aviation white paper, what Australians should hear is that the government is not committed unequivocally, to doing something with strength on consumer protections. Let me just make this point also. Senator Sheldon accused Senator McKenzie and myself, the authors of this bill, of yet another thought bubble. Well, let me just tell you about the other thought bubble that Senator McKenzie and myself had last year when we brought to this chamber a private senator's bill to reinstate the ACCC monitoring regime. Guess what happened to that thought bubble? Guess what happened to that political stunt? We got the first report in the second tranche of the ACCC monitoring regime. So, in actual fact, when Australians are asked to look at, think about, where is airline aviation competition policy being driven from in this country, it's not being driven from the Department of Transport, it's not being driven from Minister Catherine King's office, it's been driven by this Senate chamber. By this Senate chamber. Who would have thought that the people driving, making a case for urgency around improvements to airline aviation issues are in fact Senator McKenzie and myself, supported by, rather reluctantly, but I think it is important to give credit where credit is due, the likes of Senator Pocock, who saw the merit in re-establishing the ACCC monitoring regime when the government did not want to do it, when the government's hand was forced by a private senator's bill in this place, an issue subsequently taken up by Senator Pocock. So when Australians think about who are the people most committed now and into the future in driving better outcomes for Australia's aviation consumers, it is in fact the coalition. So far from being a stunt, far from being a thought bubble, private senators' bills like this one force the government's hand. And why does the government's hand have to be forced? Why does the government's hand have to be forced on issues in airlines, issues designed to drive more competition? And I just want you to think about this point. Why is it that the government can be so committed to competition in supermarkets that it supported a Senate inquiry, appointed Craig Emerson to conduct a review, has got the ACCC conducting a review? Why can the government focus on supermarket competition but is dead silent? Dead silent. Not a shadow of action, not a shadow of a movement of action on airline competition issues. The government says, oh, we've got an aviation white paper process which will follow the aviation green paper process. Well, guess what? Guess what? That is the government's second-term agenda. That is not the government's first-term agenda, because this first term of the government is almost finished. There'll be a budget, and colleagues like myself and others speculate that there'll be a federal election later this year. Senator Farrell, are you saying there's not going to be a federal election later this year? Oh, there we go. I don't doubt that. I don't doubt the trickery. Senator Farrell says we can go through to next year. I don't doubt that. That is a fact. That's not in dispute. But will you? I doubt you will. This is my grand thinking. There will be a federal budget. The government will argue that the economic conditions are improving, and we'll have a federal election later this year. And what does that mean for the government's aviation green paper and aviation white paper process? It becomes part of their second-term agenda. And guess who pays for that? Australian families who want to travel to their loved ones and their extended families across this country. Who pays for that? Australia's diaspora communities, who pay for higher prices when they want to travel overseas to visit their families, and Australian businesses who have to fly across this great, vast land of ours in order to do business. Australians are paying a very high price for the government's inaction. Why do we know that the government is forcing higher prices and poorer outcomes on Australian aviation consumers? Why do we know that? Because the ACCC monitoring report, the The first report in the second tranche, thanks to Senator McKenzie and my private senator's bill late last year, thanks to the support of people like David Bocock, which was released just last month, guess what it says? Guess what it says? It says that Australian consumers are paying higher prices. So let me just read from the most recent ACCC monitoring report. And the ACCC monitoring report is important because it uses the full armoury, the full resources of the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission to bring facts to the table about the extent to which this country does or doesn't enjoy competition in our airline industry, and it brings facts to the table in regards to prices that Australian consumers are forced to pay. Now, it's not a difficult document to read, and even the laziest of government senators only need to read 2 pages, and that's the first 2 pages in the monitoring report. So I want to just highlight 4, perhaps 5 comments in that first ACCC monitoring report in the second tranche of reports. The first point it makes, I think, is very, very revealing. It talks about the structural problems in Australia's aviation industry. It says that the trends observed over the past 12 months, which are negative trends, I might add, the trends observed over the past 12 months appear to be structural and unlikely to change in the short term. Unlikely to change in the short term. That is a direct statement by the ACCC making a judgment, I believe, that the government's reform agenda, if there is one, is not going to happen, not going to deliver outcomes in the short term. It goes on to say, and I quote, however, and it talks about the importance of economy airfares, however, it says best discount economy airfares have not yet fallen to pre-pandemic levels. The general fall, when adjusted for inflation, may not reflect consumer experiences, who are still paying significantly more to fly in nominal terms than they did prior to the pandemic. Not Senator McKenzie's accusation, not Senator Smith's accusation, a comment from the ACCC monitoring report. It goes on to say, and this is a critical point when we consider the matter of this bill, which goes to consumer protections. It says, despite evidence of falling airfares and stability in overall passenger volumes and capacity service, reliability remains a significant concern. Reliability remains a significant concern. It says factors contributing to poor service reliability and within the airline's control include efforts to manage systemic issues associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, pilot shortages, pilot training bottlenecks and some supply chain disruptions. What does that mean? That means that these matters are wholly within the domain of Australia's airline industry, and it is up to them. They have the capacity to fix them. But because the government will not lead in bringing airlines to the table, bringing other stakeholders to the table to discuss and agree better consumer protections, Senator McKenzie and myself have been forced to do so in this private senator's bill. And this private senator's bill is not a complicated piece of legislation. It says that the minister representing the government must consult within a specified time period to bring forward to this parliament a range of consumer protections that will substantially improve the experience of Australia's airline consumers. And again, in Senator Sheldon's contribution, it was interesting. He did not say he was necessarily opposed to this bill. He did not. He did not. So there's no reason why Senator Sheldon can't add his energy, his very clear and obvious commitment to aviation issues, to making sure that this bill passes in a way that delivers consumer protections, not in the never-never, but in the immediate term. Australians are right to ask, why, after 2 years of this government, can they make other issues, the voice, for example, a priority, but they can't make driving down prices, improving customer outcomes, delivering better outcomes, better service outcomes for Australians, families who pay large sums of money to travel across this country, to be reunited with their families for leisure. Why can't the government make this a priority? Why can't it fast-track its green paper and white paper process? Senator Sheldon made another interesting comment. He said, well, all of these bits and pieces in the aviation reform process, they're interrelated and they have to be addressed together. That's just not true. That is just not true. Nowhere does it say that airline consumer protections have to be dealt with at the same time as other aviation reform issues. Nowhere does it say that. In fact, when the ACCC made its submission to the aviation green paper process in February last year, its submission is almost 12 months old, it made no comment. It made no comment about the interrelatedness of various aviation reform initiatives. And in fact, pages 26 to 30 of that submission is a very, very valuable read because it acts as an endorsement. The ACCC submission acts as an endorsement to this private senator's bill that Senator McKenzie and myself have introduced this morning. So, whether or not Australians continue to pay higher prices for their airline tickets is completely within the control of the government, and the government's plan so far has been one of delay and procrastination. And just think for a moment. Higher airline prices are coming at a cost to Australian families and their household budgets. At the same time, they are adjusting to the cumulative effect of 12 interest rate rises, the cumulative effect on household budgets of energy price rises, the cumulative effect of increased prices on shopping centre shelves, the cumulative effect of declining real wages, and the government says there's nothing to see here. Well, gold medal to Senator McKenzie in her role as the Shadow Minister for Transport and therefore aviation issues in bringing forward to this Senate chamber a real plan that will deliver better outcomes for Australian aviation consumers.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. And I rise to support this bill because it's simply common sense. Australians should be protected, should have consumer protections in place when they are disrupted on their travel plans, especially when those plans are disrupted by the large airline companies who have significant market power in this country and have been exposed over the past few years of offering substandard customer experiences. This bill is very simple, and I applaud my colleague Senator Bridget McKenzie for bringing it forward. It simply makes sure that if an Australian consumer has their plane, their flights cancelled, they are properly compensated. There should be minimum standards of treatment. It makes sure that if you lose your baggage and doesn't turn up, that you are compensated for that loss. I think most Australians would expect that to be the case, but it can be sometimes a costly and timely procedure. And it also makes sure that there is a cost associated with lengthy delays to the airline providers to make sure they are not gaming the system in delaying flights or otherwise trying to maximise their profits instead of doing what they promised to do. These changes are necessary because our major airlines have not been responding to the legitimate customer complaints that we have seen, especially since flying resumed after the COVID pandemic. We have seen airlines state publicly that you don't apparently really book a particular time and location when you book a flight these days. According to one airline executive, you just book a right to fly at some undefined point in the future. That is not what Australians expect. It's not what they're told when they go to book. There are particular times when the flight's meant to take off, particular times when it's meant to land, and anything that the airlines think otherwise would be misleading and deceptive conduct in the extreme. Now, the provisions that are in this bill that Senator Bridget McKenzie had brought forward are very similar to protections that are in place in major other countries, including in the US, in Canada and in European countries too. It doesn't seem to make any sense to me about why the government wouldn't be supporting these now. Who cares where the good ideas come from? Let's just support them and get this stuff done. Let's protect the Australian consumers and respond to this major issue. But continuously over the past 18 months, this government has shown themselves to be running a protection racket for Qantas and the other major airline providers in this country. They have at every step in the way sought to defend the likes of Alan Joyce, the Qantas executive team, the other airlines, and done absolutely nothing to rein in the market power position, the abuse of that position that our airline companies are taking. We saw in response to the pandemic that the airlines all had to cancel a lot of flights, and that wasn't their fault. That was obviously something that was imposed on them. But a lot of flights had to be cancelled. Our airlines were provided billions of dollars of taxpayer money to compensate them for that outcome, that unfortunate outcome, and they dragged their heels in providing proper refunds for Australian customers. In fact, I heard from some in the industry that there was an explicit strategy of the Qantas CEO, Alan Joyce, to force people, to push people into taking a credit for their cancelled COVID flights rather than getting a refund. Apparently, Mr Joyce had established 2 different call centre teams to deal with people that were seeking a change or refund to their flights, and if you push the button on the automatic talking machine on your phone, if you push the button saying "I want a credit," you were sent through to a team that was very well staffed, had a lot of resources, and would deal with your issue promptly. If you push the button that you wanted a refund, you wanted actually your money back for something that was a service that wasn't being provided, you got pushed through to a call centre that was massively understaffed, and you'd be on the phone for hours. And apparently Mr Joyce was boasting about this a wonderful corporate strategy that he invented to maximise the profits of Qantas, to maximise the benefits of the taxpayer funding they had received, and effectively defrauding Australian customers across the country. There has to be a response to this kind of corporate conduct. This is a very reasonable and sensible response to that, and it should be supported. Now, I also want to talk broadly here about the situation in regards to our airline policies in this country. Senator Sheldon apparently made the point, I wasn't here for it, but I've been told that he made the point that they can't do this right now, the government can't do this right now because they have to look at airline policy in the broad, and there's a green and white paper process underway at the moment, so they need to wait for that. Well, how long has this been going on? I mean, there are some aspects of airline policy that have now been waiting years for a response, going back to the former government. Now, the former government did have a pretty good excuse. Given what happened with COVID, it was pretty hard to make many major changes to airline policy while most of our country's airline fleet was grounded. Flights weren't, in fact, taking off, or at least not many, and so it would have been inappropriate to make major changes to regulatory settings at that time. But it's been years now since the government had received a report on the slots allocation policy at the Sydney airport. There's a major issue for our country. It's a major bottleneck for our country. in that most flights leave from or terminate to Sydney, the busiest airport in the country, and the allocation of space there for airplanes at the Sydney airport has huge ramifications and knock-on effects to travel right across the country, not even those, including those that aren't travelling to or from Sydney, because it affects the whole network of planes across the country. Now, those slots, as they're called, they're parking spaces basically for planes as they arrive and depart, those slots are allocated through a very complicated procedure which gives precedence, effectively, to the incumbent users of those slots or their historical allocation over time. Those incumbent providers, almost invariably majority of those slots go to Qantas and Virgin, a few to some regional operators and others, but mostly to Qantas and Virgin. Those slots remain with those incumbent providers, providing they use them to a certain percentage of the time. If they use them at a certain percentage of the time, they get to keep these slots. Now, there is very credible evidence that came to us during the cost of living inquiry and hearings on this matter. There was very credible evidence that especially Qantas, possibly Virgin too, are effectively gaming the slot allocation system to make sure they maintain their slots, and those slots are therefore not made available to potential competitors to their market position. And because of this issue, it's been a long-standing issue, the former Minister for Infrastructure, Michael McCormack, had commissioned a review into it. That review reported back, I think, in 2021 or something of that nature, years ago. As I say, at the time it was inappropriate to respond to that review or make decisions because of the COVID situation. But now that's long gone. We've been flying again now for a couple of years. We really opened up 2 years ago, almost to the date, and now we're still waiting on the Minister, the now Minister for Infrastructure, Minister King, to respond to this major issue. And the response, of course, could have a negative impact on Qantas, but a positive impact for Australian consumers. Because if they are gaming this system and putting up unnecessary barriers to competition, that is, of course, weakening the customer experiences in the airline market, potentially making these cancelled flight issues a bigger deal. And the way this situation could be being gamed is that Qantas is booking these slots for a flight ahead of time and selling customers the seats and all these things. And then just beforehand they could cancel it for a variety of reasons and excuses that they can come up with. That would still give them that quota, still make them reach that threshold to keep that slot. But of course the customers who have their flight cancelled pay an enormous price, even if they got their money back, they pay disruption, their travel plans are cancelled. Also Qantas can maintain an incumbent position in the market. The system should change. It has to change. Things are not working as intended there. But yet this Minister, Minister King, has been sitting on this report now for almost 2 years as she's been the Minister. There's no seemingly action on this. And she seems to, as I said earlier, just be running a protection racket for Qantas. She kept Qatar out of this country with very little excuse or reason for it. Although, sorry, there were lots of reasons and excuses. They just changed almost every day over a matter of months. There was no incoherent explanation for why the Minister refused to have more competition to Qantas coming in the international market, and now the Minister seems to be protecting Qantas from more competition in the domestic market as well. That is what's leading to these poor customer outcomes, which are continuing to bedevil the market. Cancellations are continuing to be above their historical average. There's constant complaints of lost baggage and poor performance by the airlines, and there clearly needs to be a response here to bring the airlines into line. And that's what this bill does. This bill provides reasonable protections for consumers to make sure that they get proper outcomes when they're flying around this country. And I want to finish by stressing how important this is for people across Australia. Obviously, we're a very big landmass, somewhat sparsely populated, especially between our major cities, and that has meant that we don't have in this country the same type of rail or timely road networks that other countries might. It takes a long time to travel by road between our major centres, and and we don't have the fast rail type networks that you see in Europe or in North Asia. And so really most people are left with the plane as the only option to travel long distances. And a lot of people have to do this not just to go on a holiday, but to receive medical treatment, to do business. And that especially is true for those of us that live in regional areas where we have to travel to a major city to access a variety of services. Some of those services are life-changing, life-saving. People have to travel to receive often cancer treatment or other medical treatment on a regular basis, chronic treatment, not just in the case of an emergency. Sometimes people have to travel multiple times a year just to manage their health issues. Other people in the town where I am, in Rockhampton, they have to travel for business. They have to go to a place like Brisbane for major financial or legal services, which are just simply not available in their local town. And so these services are essential for people's livelihoods and peace of mind. And the frustration that has emerged in the past few years through the cancellations, through the excessive prices, through the lack of customer service when things go wrong, has added a level of stress to those in very difficult circumstances that might be in poor health, and a level of cost for those that are just trying to go about their business in this country. So it's very important as a nation that we have efficient airline networks servicing our entire country, servicing our sparsely population. Those industries are not serving Australians well at this stage, and there clearly needs to be a response to make sure that we have efficient airline service right around this country. But this government, when it does seem to be doing something, is running this protection racket that I've mentioned, and then sometimes just seems to be completely asleep at the wheel. We haven't heard from Minister King. I don't know where she is. She's just completely disappeared off the face of the earth. Yeah, she's at the airline lounge waiting for a flight, perhaps. But she doesn't. We don't know. Where is she been? And as I say, she's got this major report on slot allocation in Sydney. We've heard no response from her. What the hell is going on? And now we have a government that's seemingly not taking up these common-sense ideas, instead saying, oh, we're doing more reviews, and it could be months and months away before Australians receive any kind of relief or response. Why don't we just get on with it and pass this bill? It's very, very simple. It would make the minister actually do something. This bill doesn't outline in detail what the requirements would be, and I think that's appropriate for an overriding piece of legislation. All the bill says is that the minister must, within 12 months, come up with some of these rules to protect Australian consumers. And at the very least, passing this bill might actually make the Minister for Infrastructure do something. That would be good, because she'd have to, within 12 months, do something for a change, because right now it's pretty hard to understand what the Minister for Infrastructure is doing, apart from just running a protection racket for Qantas.
Thank you. Senator Davey.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. I want to put a scenario to the chamber. I want to provide a case study. Imagine that you live 2.5 hours drive from your nearest airport. Imagine you get up very early in the morning, sun's still not up, you beat the sun, you're on the way to the airport to meet your flight. You know you've got to check in half an hour before the flight, so you're on the road, and you get a ping on your phone about 100 kilometres down the road. Obviously, you can't pick up your phone because you're driving, and that would be illegal. So you pull over, you check your phone, only to be notified that your flight has been delayed. You're already 100 kilometres away from home, and you've still got 150 kilometres left to go, but they're letting you know your flight's delayed. At least you don't have to speed. You get to the airport. You're delayed, you sit around twiddling your thumbs and waiting. Meanwhile, you've got a connecting flight. And you know, because you know the track record of some of our airlines, you've actually left maybe a good hour and a half between when your flight should have landed to when your connecting flight was going to take off. But this delay is closing that window rapidly. You get another notification, your flight's been delayed again. Well, you can write off getting your connecting flight. So you have to get online and try and rebook another flight, potentially wear the penalties. And because you're travelling from a regional area, you're travelling different airlines. The first flight is a different airline to the second flight. So there's no recognition or compensation that your need to change flights has been caused by an airline's delay. So you've now written off a whole day because of a flight delay. Now that would be the reality for me every time I want to come to Parliament if I chose not to drive. But because I cannot rely on airlines, because the standard operating procedure for many airlines nowadays is to just delay flights, because we've now got the percentage of flights being delayed by the airlines is increasing, I can't afford to risk using the airlines to get me to Canberra, so I drive. It is faster, it's more efficient for me to drive. But the impact for regional people of the practices of the airlines to delay or cancel flights is significant. I know people living in Broken Hill who have to fly to Sydney for specialist treatment, and they end up booking flights a day before their appointments just to be sure they're going to be in Sydney for their appointment. That increases their cost because now they have to pay for an extra night's accommodation. So they pay for the horrendously expensive flights when we're talking about regional flights. They pay for an extra night's accommodation. They see the specialist. And then they hope that they can get back home that day. Otherwise, they're faced with another expensive night's accommodation. That is the reality for people living in the regions right across this country. When we can't rely on our airlines to depart on time, and it's leading to increased costs for regional Australians who just want to look after their own health. It is a very sad state of affairs. I mean, when you purchase a plane ticket and the plane is meant to leave on time, it's meant to arrive on time, and your baggage is meant to arrive with you, is that too much to ask? Now, let me be clear. We all know that sometimes there are circumstances which require delays, and that is fair and reasonable. If there are weather concerns, it's fair and reasonable. If there are safety concerns, it is fair and reasonable. But if it's just because the airline has decided they didn't get quite enough bookings for the first flight of the day, so they're just going to bump everyone to the second flight of the day, that is not fair and reasonable. If it is just inconvenient for the airlines, or, as my colleague Senator Canavan said, if they're just booking up the slots, selling tickets to book up the slots, but then they want to consolidate the ticket sales and they'll cancel the slots, causing havoc to competition in the airline industry, then that's not fair and reasonable. And if it is because Air Services Australia have not looked into the future and determined how many people they actually need to run our airport services, and they haven't recruited enough and trained enough people, that's not fair and reasonable either, because that's not the fault of the flying consumer. But the aviation industry has gone backwards. Prior to COVID, if we booked an airline ticket, there was only a 1.5% chance that your flight would be delayed. That could be considered fair and reasonable. Now, in January 2024, 3.1% of flights were cancelled, and the long-term average rate of cancellations has blown out. That's not fair and reasonable. What is going on? Why have we gone backwards from pre-COVID era? And why are our airlines, and indeed the minister, not taking action? How can it be that once upon a time Qantas was one of our most trusted brands and was considered the airline to book because you knew you would leave on time and arrive on time, and now people are avoiding Qantas like the plague? When did we take our eye off the consumers and start focusing on the market giants? This bill isn't a silver bullet, I admit that, but this bill will require action to be taken. This bill will put the focus back on the consumers. It will prioritise the consumers. It will actually make the airlines accountable. So they will have to justify what is a fair and reasonable delay or cancellation. I mean, many people don't realise that there is no code of conduct in the aviation industry, even though there have been ongoing concerns raised and a call for the ACCC by the ACCC and other consumer advocacy groups to develop a code of conduct for the aviation industry. We need a code of conduct so that we don't have inconsistent fare types, and so that the experiences of third-party purchasers of airfares can be highlighted, and to ensure fair and proper treatment of passengers, so that passengers get to where they're going when they need to get there with their baggage. Just this week, one of my colleagues arrived here in Canberra only to find that their baggage had been lost in transit. They came in a very amusing mismatched attire because their baggage had been lost. And what was the response of the airline? We might find it. We'll let you know when we find it. Don't know how many days you might have to walk around in the same socks and jocks, but we'll find it eventually. That's not good enough. I mean, you arrive at the airport with your bag half an hour beforehand, because that's what you're required to do. You check in your bag, it's tagged, you watch it go down into the boondock, into the belly of the airport, and you expect it to get on the plane with you, the same plane that you're getting on. You've got your barcoded boarding pass and the barcoded ticket that went on your suitcase. You should be getting on the same plane. How is it then possible that when you land, there's no sign of your baggage? In this day and age, when you just should be able to point your little laser at the barcode and you should know where it goes. It is absolutely ridiculous that we are still losing baggage in this day and age. It is not fair, again, particularly to regional passengers, that we can't be guaranteed that we're going to land on time with all our bags. This bill will establish minimum standards. It's not too much to ask. Minimum standards for the treatment of passengers who experience delays, cancellation, or sometimes a denial of boarding. Minimum standards to ensure that passengers are provided with the essential amenities needed, such as food and water and accommodation, during such disruptions. That is what is
time for
required.
debate has expired. I call the clerk.